right, thank you for your patience, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's, soon-to-be evening's Radio Christi event, Jesus, History, or Mistake. We're excited to be discussing the question, does the historical evidence justify belief that Jesus rose from the dead? My name is Peter Kinney. I'm the current president of the Radio Christi Club, and I have the privilege of introducing these gentlemen that we have up here tonight to be discussing this question. Just also real quickly, if anyone is not familiar with the Student Union bathrooms, there's kind of like a Y. When you exit out the doors, there's a Y over here. If you go to the left side of the hall, there's men's bathrooms, and the right side is women's bathrooms, so just to let you guys know. Now to introduction. So joining us tonight, we have Dr. Mike Licona. He has a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Pretoria, which he completed with distinction. He serves as an associate professor of theology at Houston Baptist University. He was interviewed by Lee Strobel in his book, The Case for the Real Jesus, and appeared in Strobel's video, The Case for Christ. He's the author of numerous books, including The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, and Paul Meets Muhammad. He also co-authored the award-winning book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, with Dr. Gary Habermas, and co-edited Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science with Dr. William Dembski. Dr. Licona is a member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society of Biblical Literature, and he's also spoken on more than, I'm told tonight, 90 university campuses, and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. We also have tonight with us Dr. Matt McCormick, one of Sac State's own. He earned his PhD from the University of Rochester in philosophy, and is a professor of philosophy here at Sac State who specializes in atheism, philosophy of religion, epistemology, and critical reasoning. He has published Atheism and the Case Against Christ and has contributed to the impossibility of God and to the end of Christianity. He has also published widely in philosophy. And finally, moderating our discussion tonight, we have Dr. Di Silvestro. He is also a philosophy professor here and is the chair of the philosophy department. He received his PhD from Bowling Green State University and primarily researches ethics, metaphysics, and bioethics, and he has published Human Capacities and Moral Status and is also published in philosophy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Di Silvestro, who will explain kind of the format that we're going to have tonight, and we can get the ball rolling on the event.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Ratio Christi for helping put this together. As the chair of the philosophy department, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to Sac State if you're visitors. I recognize some of you as instructors at Sac State or students at Sac State. The department here has a long history of trying to host discussions, debates, and things like panels where we bring in multiple perspectives rather than just single lectures, although we do single lectures as well. So I encourage you to really get a lot out of this. We're going to be videotaping today's event, and so the microphones that you see are not only so that you can hear the speakers, but so that the video can pick up on the speakers with their audio. Finally, I should let you know that we are going to have microphones up at the front for the question and answer time, and we will request that you wait for a microphone to be hand-delivered to you where you're sitting, so that your voice can also be picked up on the audio-visual recording. The format for today's discussion is going to be 30 minutes for Dr. Licona, and then 30 minutes for Dr. McCormick. After that, Dr. McCormick and Dr. Licona will be up at this table, and I will be moderating their discussion between each other for maybe 15 minutes. And after that, we're going to go to the questions from the audience. The way this works is we request that you would direct your questions to one of the two speakers if possible. But if you have a question that's general enough for both of them to answer, that's fine too. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Dr. Licona up here, and I ask you to give him a warm Sacramento welcome as well.
And I want to thank Sacramento State and Ratio Christi for inviting me to participate in this afternoon's event. Well, let's just jump right into it. Our event, or question being discussed, is, does the historical evidence justify belief that Jesus rose from the dead? I'm going to be arguing for the next 30 minutes that it does, and I'm going to make two major points. Just 2 major points. So it's going to be so easy, even a Southern Baptist can understand. All right, point number 1 is that the evidence strongly suggests theism over atheism. Now, why is this important? It's important because apart from theism, then you have the resurrection of Jesus being implausible. But if theism is true, and I will contend that theism is true and has far superior evidence for it than atheism, well, then that gives plausibility to the resurrection. And then the evidence, it looks more comfortable within that kind of a context. So let's look at the evidence for theism over atheism. I'm going to give 3 subpoints here. So the first one is the data from cosmology suggests the designer of the universe. Let's look at some of that. Dyson, Clavin, and Susskind are cosmologists, not cosmetologists, but cosmologists at Princeton, Stanford, and MIT, and they published an article in 2002 titled Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant. And in that article, they look at the physics as we understand it today, and they said, well, the way the universe is, it's extremely hostile. And in fact, life in our universe, given physics, is extraordinarily unlikely. In fact, they contend that in order for life to have even appeared in our universe at any point, there would have had to have been an unknown agent who intervened for reasons of its own and create conditions that were incomprehensible. Now, these guys aren't theists. And they don't conclude that there was an external agent who created these incomprehensible conditions. What they do is they say, well, our understanding of physics must be mistaken. Perhaps there isn't a cosmological constant after all. Well, that might be. But what this does tell us, at least physics as we know it today, seem to suggest that there was a designer of the universe that laid it out with life in mind. Arno Penzias and his colleague were the 2 physicists who discovered, or I should say verified, the Big Bang in 1964. They won a Nobel Prize as a result. They discovered a blanket of microwave radiation in the center of our universe, and from that point, the universe is expanding. And so this seemed to confirm the Big Bang, and they both won Nobel Prizes as a result. Well, later on, as they started to understand how physics works more in conjunction with our universe, they saw that in many cases, you have these constants that if they varied just a little, you couldn't have intelligent life anywhere in the universe. And so Penzias turned around and he ended up saying this: astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Second subpoint is that data from molecular biology suggests the designer of life. Let's look at this a little bit. Francis Crick was one of the 2 guys who discovered DNA. He was an agnostic with strong leanings toward atheism. So he sees the molecular structure, the structure of DNA, and life in its most basic form. And here's what he concludes. He says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to be satisfied to get it going. Now, Crick and the infamous atheist astronomer Carl Sagan got together and they said, okay, well, what are the probabilities of life? It's so complex as it is. So given a 4.5 billion-year-old Earth, what are the chances of life originating on Earth by natural causes? And so they calculated the chance to be 1 in 10 to the 2 billionth power. That's a 10 followed by 2 billion zeros. That's far more than all the subatomic particles in the entire universe. Now you say, well, you've got Crick, who has strong leanings toward atheism. You have Sagan, who is certainly an atheist. How do they account for the origin of life on Earth? Well, they came up with a theory called directed panspermia, and this just simply states there were some aliens from another planet that seeded our planet. They sent some bacteria and it landed on Earth, and that's how we got life. Well, perhaps that's the case. But one thing we can look is that it looks like life came from outside the Earth, and it came from an intelligent source. Richard Dawkins is a militant atheist and also a retired evolutionary biology professor at Oxford. And he buys in. He holds the directed panspermia hypothesis. And a few years ago, he was in a movie called Expelled, and Ben Stein ended up interviewing him. And they were talking about the first self-replicating molecule. And Stein asked him, he said, well, how did this happen? And Dawkins replied, well, we don't know. So you have no idea how it started? No. Nor has anyone else. So even today, we recognize that life on its most basic level is so complex. We don't know how it originated on Earth. We have no idea. And that's according to an evolutionary biologist who is an atheist. Antony Flew, one of the most influential atheist philosophers in the latter part of the 20th century, taught at Oxford, Cambridge, a number of places. In December of 2004, he announced that he was leaving atheism, put it behind him, and now believed that God exists. Why? Because of the scientific evidence, and he said, I had to go where the evidence leads. Michael Ruse, who is a prominent philosopher of science and also an atheist, he teaches at Florida State University. He says that origins, according to the neo-Darwinian model, require a metaphysical commitment and an act of faith. The point I want to make here is when we have some who would say that Christians, theists, Christians, believe all these fairy tales about creation, but atheists have the way because they go with science. This is an illusion propagated by atheists. Atheism requires faith as well. The conclusion when we look at the data is that there is a strong case that the universe and life are products of a designer. And again, don't take my word on it, take the word of the atheist that I've quoted on here. Third, reality includes a supernatural dimension. And I want to look at 4 lines of evidence. The first concerns paranormal phenomena. Now, there's a number of these that we could appeal to. I want to talk about one that's reported in the Journal of Anthropological Research, spring 1983, by an anthropologist named Bruce Grindle. Grindle was an atheist. He taught at Florida State University, and he lived among the Sisala people in northern Ghana for a little over a year when he witnessed someone raised from the dead. The person raised was a highly respected drummer in the tribe named Ali. A few days after Ali's death, Grindle was invited to witness the burial ritual. He traveled 5 miles to the village and entered the compound where the corpse was prepared. Grindle writes, quote, "The corpse was already putrid, oozing malodorous juices. An old woman was sitting next to the dead man with a fan. Even though the corpse had been washed about 3 hours earlier, the stench in the room was horrible." End quote. The burial ritual began the following day near midnight. Ali was now dead for 3 to 4 days. The corpse was seated upright against a wall. A group of singers began to dance around it. Grindle said he then, quote, "saw the corpse jolt and occasionally pulsate. The corpse, shaken by spasms, then rose to its feet, spinning and dancing in a frenzy. As I watched, convulsions in the pit of my stomach tied not only my eyes, but also my whole being into this vortex of power. The corpse picked up the drumsticks and began to play. After a while, the corpse was once again sitting propped against the west wall of the compound. In conclusion, I can say with intuitive certainty that on the night of 23 October 1967, I witnessed the raising of the dead. This experience was real and was seen as such by those who sat to my right in the divination place. It was as though everybody present simultaneously touched a live wire. No words were said. Indeed, what could be said? Now, as I mentioned, Grindle was an atheist. He wasn't after this experience. I have spoken with his widow. He died in 2012. I've spoken with one of his former students. And they both say that this experience disturbed him for the rest of his life. and he also gave up his atheism. He never wanted to talk about this experience after getting it put in writing, because obviously that would have been disturbing to see something like this. This kind of paranormal phenomenon, I could name a lot more, is something that atheism finds it very difficult to accommodate. Second line of evidence is near-death experiences, or NDEs. Now, there are tens of thousands of these, and almost all of them, I should say, you can't corroborate the evidence. You know, there's just not enough evidence to corroborate that they went to hell, or they went to heaven, or they came out of their body, and things like this. Some of them have even been proven fraudulent. But there are, as of now, 300 NDEs that have data that has been corroborated so that the person, while dead, received accurate information they could not have known otherwise. A book just came out this year with 100 of them. It's called The Self Does Not Die, Verified Paranormal Phenomena from Near-Death Experiences. Again, just this year it came out and has 100 corroborated cases in it. Let me just read one of them to you, and this is about a girl named Crystal Mertzlock. She was a 7-year-old girl in Utah. In 1982, she drowned in a community swimming pool, was underwater for 17 minutes, about 17 minutes, and without a heartbeat for at least 45 minutes. Crystal was taken to a hospital where she was eventually stabilized and breathing on her own, but she remained in a coma. 3 days later, Crystal came out of her coma. And this was astonishing in itself, but what she then told the physician, Melvin Moores, who had worked to save her, was even more astonishing. She said she floated outside of her body while dead, and while the physicians and nurses were working to resuscitate her. She provided accurate descriptions pertaining to the physical appearances of the physicians, the number of people in the room, the equipment they had used, the procedures performed on her, and the conversations that took place, all while her eyes were closed and she was profoundly comatose the entire time. Crystal claimed to have gone to heaven while dead. She also said she went to her house. She described what each of her family members were wearing, what they were doing, the toys with which each sibling played, the song one of her sisters sung while playing, and what her mom had cooked for dinner. All of those details ended up being true. Melvin Moores, the physician, says seeing this led him to alter his worldview. He gave up his atheism as a result. Third line of evidence is apparitions, apparitions of the dead. You might call these ghosts, and I know Matt over here, he scorns at ghosts. I wouldn't call them ghosts just because ghosts might have a different definition, but an apparition would be some kind of a spirit being that would appear to another in a form. Usually it's ethereal of some sort, you couldn't touch it. There are a number of these that have corroborating evidence. I know a person who experienced one. In fact, I've known her for about 25 years. Her and her husband, Pat and Doug Ferguson, are really good friends of my wife and I. And Pat, when she was 14 years old, she was asleep and was awakened one Sunday morning, early in the morning, and it was dark, and she figured, oh, I'll go back to sleep. She closed her eyes, and when she opened her eyes, there was this face of a girl about 3 to 6 feet in front of her, I forgot which, about 3 to 6 feet in front of her, a girl she hadn't seen for several years, but was a friend of her, had been a friend of hers. And it scared her. It was illuminated, and it had a frightful look on her face. So she was really afraid. She closed her eyes, figured she was hallucinating or dreaming, and opened them, and it was still there. And she closed her eyes, bit her tongue, pinched herself, did this a couple times, opened her eyes. The face was still there. Finally, pretty scared, she closed her eyes. She did the last thing she knew how to do. She prayed the Lord's Prayer, and when she opened her eyes, the face was gone. She looked over the clock, it was 2:30 Sunday morning. Monday comes and goes. Tuesday morning she gets up, she comes down for breakfast, her mom's fixing breakfast, her dad is reading the paper. He takes the paper, puts it down, turns it around, pushes it toward Pat, and says, Pat, do you know this girl right here? Pat said, yeah, why? She died. What happened? Well, she was at the Scope, that's a big a center where they play basketball games and hockey games and stuff, an arena. And Saturday night, she had gone to a Loggins and Messina concert. After the concert, she was up in the top row and talking to some friends, leaning up against a curtain. And she thought there was a wall behind the curtain, but there wasn't. So when she leaned back, she fell down 20 feet on concrete. They took her to the hospital, and she died 2:30 Sunday morning. That's kind of freaky. It's spooky. I mean, how do you have it that the face of that person shows up right there in the room in front of her at 2:30, the very moment that she had died? It's very difficult to explain under an atheistic worldview. Very easy under theism. Radically answered prayer. Now, I'm not just talking about the kind of prayers, Lord, I'm traveling from San Jose, driving up to Sacramento for this afternoon's event. Please get me safe, and I get here safe. Oh, God answered my prayer. Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Who knows? I'm talking about radically answered prayer. I've been a Christian for 45 years. I can say there's probably, I could count them on a single hand, radically answered prayer that I've experienced. But I'm going to give you just one, and it doesn't come from me. It comes from an atheist who used to be a Christian. And years ago, I think it was 2008 or 2009, we were involved in an email exchange, and we talked about the evidence for the resurrection. And then I brought up miracles, and he said, yeah, I'd been there, done that. You know, when I was much younger, I went to church with my dad, and my dad was a deacon or something like that. We had a small church, and he wrote the following. One time my church desperately needed $7,641 in order to keep going. After an all-night prayer meeting, my dad went to pick up the mail, and in it was a check for exactly $7,641 from someone who didn't even know the church needed the money, but had heard one of the pastors speak a few years ago. My dad contacted the giver, and she said that after she'd heard the pastor speak, she felt God wanted her to put some cash in an annuity and give it to our church. The process took several years, and just days before, she decided to close the account and send the accrued money to the church. And it happened to be the exact amount that was needed right after an all-night prayer meeting. He'd go on just a few lines later and say, so I looked as hard as I could, but finally I realized I had no good reasons to think God existed. So we've got some radically answered prayer, and we could give just so many different, and I'm sure if there's some Christians here in the audience, you could probably maybe think of a couple for yourself that you've experienced. These fit far more in line with theism than atheism. So the conclusion, there is a strong case that reality includes a supernatural dimension, and there's a strong case that the universe and life itself are products of a designer. Now, design and the supernatural, they are not at home within atheism. Atheism cannot accommodate them. However, they fit right at home in theism, the belief that God exists and acts in our world. And so when I look at two conflicting worldviews, of course they both can't be right. When I look at both worldviews, I'm going to look at the things, the evidence we have, the data that I experience, that I can see going on in our world, in our reality, and I'm going to go with the worldview that accommodates that. And so when the evidence is considered, theism is far more likely to be true than atheism. And miracles, therefore, such as the resurrection of Jesus, are plausible. Now that leads us to our second point now, second major point, and that is the historical data suggests Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not going to be able to get into a whole lot of this. I do have a book that's a little over 700 pages that I get into it in a lot more detail. I even get into a lot more detail in some public debates I've had with some leading atheists and agnostics and Muslims. And you can go to my website, risenjesus.com, and watch those if you like and decide for yourself. Let me just give you some simple evidence here. Historians, none of us historians and archaeologists, geologists, evolutionary biologists, none of us can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusions. All we can do is look at the data and formulate hypotheses and see which hypothesis best explains those data. So I've heard it explained like this. It's like being dealt a hand of cards. You always wish you had more cards. And you wish the cards that you had were better. But you still got to deal with the hand you've been dealt, right? And the same thing when we deal with anything in history, whether it's deciding whether Caesar actually crossed the Rubicon in January 49 BC, or whether Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus on the battlefield at Philippi. So whatever we're looking at, we've got sources. We wish we had more sources. We even wish the sources we had were better. But we got to deal with the sources we have and play with those sources. So the question is, what kind of sources do we have when it comes to something like the resurrection of Jesus? And is the evidence we have sufficient to establish that it's reasonable to believe, or that we're justified in believing that he rose from the dead? So let's look. First cards we're going to look at is Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Now, Clement of Rome was probably a disciple of the Apostle Peter, and Polycarp a disciple of the Apostle John. Now, some of you, if you're going to have kids someday, if you're going to be looking for names, if you have a son, just remember some of these, okay? Like Polycarp. Now, so these guys knew the apostles, Peter and John, two of the lead apostles, and so whatever information they have, they're going to have received it from them. So let's see what they have to say. Clement says that the apostles were fully assured by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and Polycarp says the one who raised Jesus from the dead will raise us also. So you say, well, why are they Jags? Well, in order to be kings, you've got to be an eyewitness. Well, why not queens, since they're getting their information from the eyewitnesses? Well, the problem is that Clement is writing, we're not sure. Some go for an early date, just maybe 3 decades later. Some, right now, the majority go with a later date, which is about 60 years after Jesus' death, 55 to 60 years. And Polycarp is writing somewhere between maybe 80 to 100 years after Jesus. So they're writing kind of along afterwards. So we give them Jags. If they were writing closer, we'd give them queens. Then we have 4 Gospels. The first 2 we look at is Mark and Luke. Now, the majority of New Testament scholars today, and when I say that, there are thousands of New Testament scholars, and so I'm referring not only to conservatives, but also moderates, liberals, atheists, agnostics, Jewish. You say, are there really atheist New Testament scholars? You bet, there are lots of them. Are there agnostics? You bet, lots of them. So we're looking at everyone this way. Now, the majority of New Testament scholars today say that Mark, the traditional authorship of Mark, is correct. That Mark got his information primarily from Peter, the lead apostle. So we're only one step removed from an eyewitness. The majority of scholars likewise agree in the traditional authorship of Luke, that Luke got his information from eyewitnesses, apostles, Paul also used Mark as one of his major sources, and perhaps a source, it's a hypothetical source that scholars refer to as Q, short for the German word Quelle, which just simply means source. If you want me to unpack that, I'd be happy to do it in our discussion period. But so we've got some, only one removed from eyewitnesses here as well. What about the other 2? Oh, so they're queens because they're writing closer to the events. Matthew and John. Now, the early church tradition says that Matthew was a tax collector and one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and that John was the son of Zebedee, the author of John. Or some have interpreted the early church fathers to be saying John the Elder, who was one of Jesus' minor disciples. We really don't know. I lean toward John the son of Zebedee, but some go with John the Elder, one of Jesus' minor disciples who traveled with him along from Jesus' baptism up through his resurrection and afterward. The majority of scholars today do not accept the traditional authorship that either John the Elder or John the son of Zebedee wrote the gospel attributed to him. However, the majority of scholars say that whoever the author was, he got his information directly from either John the son of Zebedee or one of Jesus' disciples. So we're still just one removed. You got a king there, or queen. Matthew's a little more difficult. I wish I had time to get into it, but he's pretty difficult. There's stuff with the early church tradition that can be interpreted in numerous different ways, and there are some challenges. So without getting into details, I'll just tell you that I think that Matthew was involved in writing the gospel. He played some role, but I'm not sure what that role was. And I'll just assign him a 10. So we can have the least confidence in the role of the traditional authors when it comes to Matthew. Then we have Paul, who's an ace. Now, he's an ace because Paul was not a believer at the time of his conversion experience. He was a radical, militant enemy of Christianity, and he believed it was God's will to destroy the church, the movement that Jesus had started. But Paul says that all changed when Paul had an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him, and it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders, one who was so convinced Jesus had appeared to him that he was willing to endure lots of hardships, including beatings, imprisonment, whippings, and even martyrdom by the Romans. So his testimony is pretty good. And plus, Paul knew the Jerusalem apostles, and we can certify that he was preaching the same gospel message they were preaching. So for example, in Galatians chapter 2, he says a few years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and met with the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John, and ran the gospel message past them that he'd been preaching to make sure he was preaching the same gospel message they were. And they verified, they certified he's preaching the same thing. At least that's what Paul says. So historians look for corroborating sources. And so Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, one of those three Paul said he met with, says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Polycarp also quotes from Paul's letters twice and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. Clement, who was Peter's disciple, refers to Paul as the blessed Paul and places him on par with his mentor Peter. These are precisely the things that you would do if Paul was telling the truth, that he was preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. Now, wouldn't it be great if we had something where Paul said, I want to tell you what that gospel message is? Well, we've got that. It's 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1. Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message that I preached to you. And then he goes on and he gives it in an oral formula, a creed, and the verses that follow, which is a summary of that gospel message. He says, I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. You notice the long, short, long, short? It's called parallelism. They did that to help facilitate memory. So they were very serious about these kinds of things, and they had all kinds of devices to help them memorize, because literacy rate was only about 10%. He talks about the appearance to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all the apostles, and then he adds his own name to the list. You got 3 individual appearances, 3 group appearances. The group appearances are significant because modern psychology informs us that group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible, because they have no external referent. They're like dreams. And you can't wake up your wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. You can't do that because there's no external referent there. So Paul's a great source because he's hostile at the time of his conversion. He's early. He claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. He knew Jesus' disciples, and we can certify he's preaching the same gospel message they are. So it's a pretty good hand that we've got. I wish we had 50 cards. I wish we had 50 aces. But it's a pretty good hand that we're dealing with there. Now, when we look at these, scholars, including skeptical ones, grant these following as undisputed facts. They're called historical bedrock. Jesus died by crucifixion. A number of his followers believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. At least one enemy claimed to have seen the risen Jesus and communicate with him. And these experiences occurred in individual and in group settings. Now, what historians do is we subject hypotheses to various criteria, such as explanatory scope. Does it explain all the facts? Power, does it explain them without forcing them to fit? Ad hoc, is it less ad hoc? Ad hoc meaning it was created for this. In other words, you see improvisation going on. And plausibility, how does it fit in with our background knowledge? When we look at the resurrection hypothesis, it fulfills all these criteria. But when we look at the leading hypothesis offered by skeptical scholars today, it's the hallucination hypothesis, we see it doesn't fare so well. It grossly lacks explanatory power and plausibility, and it is more ad hoc than the resurrection hypothesis. All it has going for it is explanatory scope. And so just scientifically speaking, historically speaking, the resurrection hypothesis is by far the best historical explanation for the historical bedrock or the known historical facts. And therefore, we are justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead. This is how historians justify their descriptions of the past. They run it through historical method. And when we do this, the resurrection of Jesus comes out far better than any others. I look forward to the rest of our dialogue.
We're going to now invite Matt McCormick to come up and give his presentation for 30 minutes, and then we'll go into our group discussion.
Hi, thanks. You're going to get a really interesting combination of views here tonight, because I'm going to stick to what might discuss mostly at the end. Primarily, I want to just talk about this resurrection question. And I've got some thoughts about reasoning generally about supernatural claims, especially from ancient historical sources. So let me make some preparatory remarks about, some caution remarks about how I think we should think generally about not just historical claims, but supernatural claims. And then I'll touch on some of the territory that Mike discussed about the resurrection. I'm not going to talk about the design argument at all. Okay, so having achieved some level of notoriety in this field, I get emails periodically from eager folks who want to argue with me about the existence of God or about the resurrection and the like. And I've taken to, before I spend a bunch of time in an email battle or exchange on the internet with somebody about this, I've taken to putting people to this question first. And I think it's really a bedrock question before you can even have a conversation about resurrections or God's existence, what have you. And I'm calling it the defeasibility test. And my questions are this. Are there any considerations, arguments, evidence, or reasons, even hypothetically, that could possibly lead you to change your mind about the God question? Is it a possible outcome as a result of our having a conversation or some hypothetical possibility that upon carefully and thoughtfully reflecting on the broadest, best body of evidence that you can gather, that you would come to think your current view about God or Jesus is mistaken? And I think it's very hard to know the answer to this question when we sort of probe our own hearts about it. But this asking this question makes lots of people go away who pester me about this, because it's not really what they're up to. They've got some other project they want to be engaged in. So I think it's a very good question to ask myself and for all of us to reflect on is what would be, hypothetically, the sort of information or the ideas that might change my mind given wherever I am currently. And also, as a preparatory remark, I'd like to say that there's a distinction I want to make between the evidence for the resurrection, sort of as Mike's presented it, versus what I'm really interested in, which is to discuss about reasoning clearly about the historical evidence for ancient religions. And here's what I mean. After spending years publishing articles and writing a book and giving thousands of lectures and having countless discussions, I'm much more interested in the latter. The evidence, I think, even on the best case scenario, is far too poor to justify anything like the strong conclusions that I hear many adherents endorsing. Mike's very polished and very good presentation notwithstanding. So I've gotten more interested in the question, given that the evidence is so bad, how is it that so many people have come to convince themselves otherwise? And I've got some ideas about that. And you're obviously, as you are in lots of cases, you're going to be forced to sort of confront what Mike has presented as his evidence and the sort of serious skeptical questions I'm raising about it. So I'm going to give you a slightly different brief recounting of the state of play concerning the historical evidence about the Gospels. It's different in a few details than Mike's, but not substantially, and I'm not really interested in sort of quibbling about the details. I'm prepared to grant, for the sake of argument, grant lots here. But I'll hit on a couple things here that Mike didn't say. So as you know, probably, Jesus is thought to have been executed around 35 AD. And I apologize for the small font. I've got a bunch of stuff I want to say. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, perhaps 1 Corinthians, Mike mentioned Galatians, are our primary sources of information about the events. Those are kings or aces in Mike's account. Mark was written by many accounts around 65 AD. There's some debate about all of these dates, but it won't matter for my purposes. The ending of Mark, as I understand it, from about 1609 on, where we start to get the story about Jesus' return, was added later by some other unknown author, decades later by most accounts, as I understand it. Matthew was written between 70 and 100 AD. Luke was written around 70. There seems to be some agreement that they were largely based on Mark and another source, now lost, called the Q source. So Mike and I are seeing eye to eye on some of that. That Mark was one of the primary sources, and then Matthew and Luke, the authors of Matthew and Luke, seem to have used some of that for their information. John was written later by a few decades, most likely. It doesn't appear that these works were written by eyewitnesses, and they weren't written by the disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, as I understand it, but they were the Gospels according to these apostles. And as Mike has laid it out, he's left it at 1 or 2 levels of remove from possible eyewitnesses. And that's fine. I don't wish to quibble about any of that. The authors of these books then heard the stories from others. We don't know how many people the stories passed through from the events to their being recorded, although Mike's argued that it's only gone through a few steps. We don't have any of the original works, the actual writings. We have copies of copies, and many people have argued that we have high fidelity copies and we can trust that the copies retained the details. The earliest ones we have of the copies are from around the late 200s. So roughly 250 years or 200 years transpire between the alleged events and the actual reports of them that we can examine. So there's sort of a gap there. But like I said, it won't really matter because of this. In these historical evidence debates, there are many people who favor the resurrection conclusion, and they argue that these works were written sooner, that Paul was an eyewitness, that the works were independent and reliable, that delusions or mistakes weren't likely, and so on. So there's a camp of people in this field who are sympathetic with the resurrection conclusion, and they will argue for the high quality and reliability and compellingness of this evidence, so they will bolster that evidence. And then there's a camp of people, the skeptics, who argue that these works were written later, that they contain conflicting stories, they're unreliable, hallucinations, delusions, what have you. So there's a sort of heavy polarization of people who are forming and publishing opinions about these different works. I don't want to dive into a debate about the dates and texts because I don't think it really matters at all. And here's why. I'm going to say a couple of provocative things about that, and then I want to move over to another topic. Rather, suppose that we've got 4 to 6 accounts of varying detail from 2,000 years ago from the actual people who claim to have seen a man come back from the dead. Would that be reasonable to believe? And I think very clearly you've got a sharp point of disagreement, insofar as there's an argument, the resurrection coming from Mike's side on this point, that clearly he thinks that much less would make it compelling, and I think even granting much more wouldn't make it compelling at all. And interesting, Mike should mention time travel, because I've got a time travel theory for you. Here's my take on this, and this debate, this discussion has been a really great opportunity for me to zero in on something that I've sort of been percolating around in my head. Suppose that we could grab the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, throw them in there at the moment they sat down to write. Because they all sat down to write decades later. We grab them in a time machine and bring them back to the present for a thorough interrogation, giving us wonderful, high-quality, high-caliber information. Now, I can imagine a whole range of results from this set of interrogations. I don't want to waterboard them or anything, but I have a whole bunch of questions, and we all do. We'd all be like chomping at the bit to get in there and talk to these guys, right? And I can imagine, let's just hypothetically imagine a full range of outcomes of that investigation. It could be that on a bit of probing and a bit of hard question asking, that a whole bunch of interesting details that we wished we had now would become revealed, and it would turn out that, oh wow, really? That's it? Oh, that's all you got about Jesus? You know, one of them says, yeah, I heard this story from a cousin of mine who knew this guy who thought maybe he came back from the dead. You know, maybe it would turn out that what they have to say is super sketchy. Or it might turn out that we pull those guys up to the modern era and we sit them down, we talk to them, and they all give us this remarkably clear, consistent, high-quality story. It all fits together. They all are quite passionate and quite utterly convinced, and they seem to be thoughtful and reasonable, and they sort of make the best case possible on Jesus' resurrection behalf. That would be the sort of two extremes that might result from this little thought experiment. Best case scenario, I think it still wouldn't be reasonable to believe that Jesus came back from the dead, even in that latter case. And I know I'm in the minority on this. It's not just that I'm sort of dead set against the idea. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what might work and what might be plausible evidence. But let me, in a few minutes, come back to why I think even if we had that, it wouldn't be enough. And I'll return in just a second. Okay, now let me proceed with a caution, because I am very reluctant to engage in debates about this topic because of this. There are a lot of examples out there of people who I've come to affectionately call defense lawyers for Jesus. And with these folks, their project, sometimes explicitly, is something like this. Given that I believe in God or Jesus, I'm going to construct the most effective criticism of contrary views that I can, thereby finding a coherent, seemingly reasonable interpretation of the evidence that permits me to sustain my belief. My goal here is to alleviate cognitive dissonance. And that doesn't sound very charitable, perhaps, but there's actually people who say, this is what I'm doing. So for these folks, they believe first, and then they reason second. They construct the rational case as a sort of a project in rationalizing. And the idea here, or what seems to happen, having sort of crossed paths with lots of folks, is that belief is sort of fixed, and the reasoning conforms to it, or it's made to conform to it. And I'll show you a case example here in a second. Now, let me present a different model, a completely different model, that I think we should all strive for. And I don't know whether we ever achieve it. By extension, also, I should point out that we can have defense lawyers for atheism, too. I've met lots of them who are dead set on constructing some sort of rationalization that will let them sustain their atheistic view, no matter what sort of contrary story or evidence they hear. So these are not mistakes. That's not a mistake that's confined to just that one side. On the contrary, I think here's a model that I think we'd all be better off pursuing. Imagine that this is sort of like the ideal, rarely achieved, but ideal model in science. Imagine that we conduct a broad open search for the relevant information, the evidence that is equally receptive to any outcome. So imagine engaging into an inquiry where you are deeply agnostic with regard to the outcome, and that you gather evidence such that the evidence you end up with is proportional and representative of all the evidence that's out there, and then you draw a conclusion as a result of what that evidence indicates. So we analyze that evidence as impartially as possible, and then we draw the conclusion that's best indicated by the evidence, whatever that might be. So I've gotten more interested in the question of reasoning, and what I've realized started through this sort of discussion about atheism, is that strikes me as being more important in my life than adopting any sort of particular conclusion, and that strikes me as being the most important thing we all ought to do in these sorts of cases. And I think detecting when we're making this mistake or we're doing one versus the other can be very hard even in ourselves. You can sometimes see it a little better in other people, but you can't always tell when you're doing it yourself. Okay, so for these folks, all conclusions, you may not be able to see that because of the table, so I'll read it slowly. For these folks, all conclusions are defeasible, hearkening back to my defeasibility test. The goal is believing only that which is best supported by all the evidence, and you're also prepared to revise your conclusion in the light of new information, should that be compelling. All right, now let me talk about a mistake, talk about the defense lawyer mistake. It's come to be known in psychology research as motivated reasoning. We've got lots of good evidence about it, and it seems to me that it's ubiquitous. It's not just in religious cases, but across the board. People do this about all sorts of things, especially about sports. People criticize information that is inconsistent with their prior beliefs or their preferences more severely, and when it's preference consistent, they relax those critical standards. And you've seen this sort of thing happen. I'll call it the umpire effect, that when you show, for instance, the very same football game to Berkeley fans and Stanford fans, and you show them the very same referee calls, The Berkeley fans are utterly convinced that the referees are opposed to their team, and the Stanford fans are all utterly convinced that the refs are opposed to their team. It's a bit like you show the same newspaper to folks, and conservatives say it's too liberal, and liberals say it's too conservative. So this is what's part of what's going on here is that motivated reasoning and prior preference and prior views are steering the reasoning, and in many cases they make us highly critical of views that we don't like or don't want for whatever reason, and they make us relax and let views slide that we find to be consistent. I heard a wonderful example of this on the radio the other day where a reporter had gotten a hold of a Trump supporter, and the woman said, everything negative that you've heard about Hillary is true, and every single negative thing you've heard about Trump is just speculation and conjecture. I thought, wow, it's really remarkable that it all lined up that way for you. Surely neither one of those can be right. Okay, so beware motivated reasoning, folks. And in my experience, especially now that I spend my time teaching reasoning, my take as a professional reasoner, not so much as a historian, but my take on looking at this debate about the historical evidence about Jesus, is that these discussions are utterly infused with people making this sort of mistake, and it has really crippled our ability to zoom out, sort of see it with fresh eyes and see it from the outside. Okay, so in those sorts of cases, we've got the tail wagging the dog. Lots of theological writers have ordered their priorities so that believing comes first, and any other information, ideas, or evidence must conform to that belief or simply be rejected. I'll give you one really rich example. It's a famous passage from Walterstorff. And forgive me, I'll read this long bit. The religious beliefs of the Christian scholar ought to function as control beliefs within his devising and weighing of theories. Since his fundamental commitment to following Christ ought to be decisively ultimate in his life, the rest of his life ought to be brought into harmony with it. As control, the belief content of his authentic commitment ought to function both negatively and positively. Negatively, the Christian scholar ought to reject certain theories on the ground that they conflict or do not comport well with the belief content of his authentic commitment. So rarely do you get somebody to say it so outright and so clearly, but this is what I mean by defense lawyer for Jesus. Walterstorff has come flat out and said, I am going to use my commitment to Jesus or to God as the measuring stick, and anything else that comes up that might be contrary to that is going to have to be worked into submission. I won't give on that. I will give on everything else. Any other theory, any other evidence, any other count, that's going to have to conform. So the challenge, I think, for all of us is that rarely, I think, are we this clear in our own heads about if this is going on in our minds. And I think the challenge is to recognize the extent to which this kind of thing's going on in you, in your heart. And this takes a lot of deep, careful self-reflection and analysis. Okay, so now with those preparatory remarks out of the way, to the effect that I think we need to be very cautious about how we're reasoning about the evidence concerning Jesus. I think motivated reasoning and upside-down thinking produce pseudo-disagreements. So in lots of these cases, what happens is that you've got defense lawyers for both sides who are trying to get their client off, and they're determined to get their client off at all costs, and they're not having an actual disagreement about what's going on. They're having a pseudo-disagreement because neither one of them is prepared to acknowledge guilt, perhaps, or acknowledge or change their minds, or acknowledge that there might be some problem. Okay, so earlier I made this outrageous claim. I said that believing in the resurrection wouldn't be reasonable even if we were able to interrogate the gospel authors. So let me say some things about why I think that's true. Consider the sources. For people in that era, first century Palestine, supernatural beliefs in magic, superstitions, mysterious forces would have been rampant. Belief in magical, miraculous events would have been the norm. They're the norm now, despite how often we know better. And in fact, Mike's given us a bunch of anecdotes about some of these very sorts of stories. That's just to say, that lots and lots of people believe in magical, supernatural, spiritual events. The base rate I maintain for accuracy for humans with regard to supernatural claims is very bad. And this is going to be the heart of the disagreement between my take on historical claims that are magical claims with Mike's take on historical claims about those events. That is, I think that when people are making supernatural claims about supernatural phenomena, they're almost always mistaken. Now let me see if I can justify that a little bit, although we don't have time to go into all the details. But I think the problem's with the source, and this is not to be disrespectful to the sources, but I think that we've got really compelling evidence to think, I think you believe this already about a lot of cases, that people are, they produce lots of these ideas, and that lots, if not most, are mistaken. Humans are very bad at thinking about strange events. Humans are faulty supernatural belief-producing machines. They believe in ghosts, spells, magic, witchcraft, miracles, prayers, charms, demons, demon possessions, the evil eye, hexes, and an endless list of other spooky spiritual forces, entities, gods, and events. We've heard about some of them today. That is, we've heard about some cases of people claiming to have had some of these weird things happen to them. The vast majority of human claims about supernatural, magical, miraculous phenomena are mistaken, however, I think. Now, it's going to be harder to establish that claim without going into a lot of other, looking at particular cases. But let me just give you some data on this one. 29% of Americans claim to be in touch with someone who's dead. A third believe in ghosts. 20% believe they've seen a ghost. 24% believe in reincarnation. Roughly 50% report having had a mystical or religious experience. 26% believe in spiritual energy in mountains, trees, or crystals. 25% believe in astrology. 38% in evil spirit possession. 16% in the evil eye or hexes. In a recent poll in England, over 4% report believing in werewolves. Now, I suppose somebody might say, yeah, exactly. The world is teeming with supernatural, spiritual, magical events and forces, and this stuff's everywhere. That's why so many people believe. But in my experience, when you start scratching the surface on these claims, you start poking and prodding, and you look at some of them, they break down really quickly. And almost invariably, there's a much easier, better, naturalistic explanation. One that consists with what we know about anecdotal reasoning and know about science and about physics and what we know about human psychology and memory and co-opted memories and bereavement hallucinations and a long list of admittedly surprising and weird but natural phenomena that account for those beliefs. Just to give you a few more, there's thriving communities of death deniers for Tupac Shakur, Michael Jackson, and Elvis, just to name a few. There are highly sophisticated defenses of the historical authenticity of the miracles of Muhammad. Ones that would be as impressive. It just takes a bit of Googling to find videos of people presenting arguments, cases of similar sort of sophistication and detail as the one that Mike's given in favor of the Jesus resurrection, yet they're doing it about Muhammad. And I maintain, and I've written about this at great length elsewhere, but there's far better evidence for real witches at Salem than what we have for the Jesus case, largely because we have the actual documents and because a real investigation was conducted and we actually looked at the people and so on, but I can save that discussion for the conversation afterwards. But you probably don't believe in any of those. You probably think those are silly. Now, if you don't, or if you think some of those, or you think the ghosts and all that stuff is real, then we've got a different sort of discussion to have. But in Bayesian terms, you can think of it this way, that you and me are coming to a question jointly, and we've got our so-called priors, is what they talk about in Bayesian probability theory, and our priors are the subjective base rates about certain sorts of background information that I bring to the conversation versus what you bring to the conversation. So very clearly, if your life has been populated with lots of supernatural events, or what you take to be supernatural events, and if your life is populated with things that you take to be answered prayers and miracles and the like, then the proposal coming from someone that hears evidence for another miracle isn't as challenging, or you're much more receptive, because your general take about the base rate for human reliability about these things is that it's very good, or that it's much higher than it is for me. So I'm a very stingy skeptic across the board, not because I've got any particular agenda, I don't think, but because I'm genuinely curious and I want to have reasonable, thoughtful beliefs. And in all of these cases where I've looked at them, and I've looked at lots of sort of near-death experience cases, for instance, we can take those. You get these problems, you get these really obvious breakdowns that, for instance, cardiopulmonary death is quite common. There will be a surgery at Sutter Hospital today where they stop someone's heart, and they will be cardiopulmonary dead for half an hour, 2 hours, while they do heart surgery on some guy on the table. So quite routine matter to stop somebody's heart. We keep them going through CPR, we keep oxygenated blood going to their brains for lots of time while we do while we operate on them. Those sorts of cases are quite common, and it's not uncommon for people to come back from one of those episodes, be in a coma or be unconscious, and come back and tell a story about floating, about hearing voices, about seeing long-lost dead relatives and the like. But we also know that there's brain activity going on in those cases, and there's oxygenated blood going into the brain, and there's regular metabolic things happening in your brain. And there's also psychoactive drugs that are getting dripped into your system through the saline that they give you to put you out. So I'm not prepared in those kinds of cases to go, oh, this guy woke up from surgery, or this guy woke up from a cold water drowning case, and he says that he went to another realm of existence. And I'm not prepared to go, oh, okay, well, he said it and he believes it, so therefore it must have happened. I think there's a much easier, much more obvious natural explanation for those cases. So that's one detail. I need to move on because I've got lots more, I've got a few more things to say. That's sort of my general take on lots of these sorts of cases. Here are 500 or so gods that you agree with me about. Humans are very fecund about producing God ideas in history. And my guess is probably, although some of you may be very open-minded, but probably a bunch of you think that most or all of these are mistakes. And that would bring me to a question I want to ask and talk about later is, what then are the differences between natural and supernatural religions as you see them? Because you probably think these are natural. And this lends support, I maintain, to my general skepticism about when people make supernatural claims. I'm doubtful. Okay, one more quick but very interesting thing I'd like to add. And this is one of the other reasons I'm skeptical about the ancient claims about about the resurrection, what have you. The internal logic, as I see it, of the historical Jesus-God story doesn't make sense. And here's why. Does it appear that God wanted us to believe in him or Jesus on the basis of the historical evidence? So suppose we grant the full, robust historical case that Mike has laid out. Does it look like God wants us to believe on the basis of that argument? And I've got to ask a question. Couldn't God, the almighty creator of the universe, the infinitely knowing master of all reality, have made it so that the resurrection obviously and unequivocally happened? Couldn't God have done better? If God wanted history to show that Jesus was resurrected, show even better than he is alleged to have shown, he certainly could have. If God had intended that we all believe in a supernatural Jesus on the basis of the historical evidence, then why did he make the evidence so crappy? Why didn't he make it as obvious as the moon? For all of us, for all of history. He's the creator of the universe, right? This can't be hard for God. Why didn't he make it so compelling that it rendered the notion of us having a debate about it completely silly? Like I'm up here arguing that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. Right? God could have done that. God would have done better if God had sought a situation where the historical evidence was so abundant, compelling, and obvious that it rendered disbelief utterly irrational. He could have easily brought about that world. But he gave us a world where this specific Christian thesis is buried in the noise of a whole bunch of other bad, very suspiciously natural-looking religions. The evidence could have been overwhelming. But he made the historical Jesus episode look just like all the other natural religions. How bad would the evidence have to be in order for you to change your mind? The truth is, I suspect that the historical evidence has very little to do with why and how most people engage their religious beliefs. Okay, now some folks talk about faith here. I'm just going to skip that so I can finish up. So in conclusion, I'll say, I give some preparatory remarks that I think reasoning about religious claims raises this question about the feasibility test. Would you change your mind under any circumstances? Motivated reasoning permeates lots of these discussions. And beware of defense lawyers for Jesus or for atheism. And here's why I doubt. I doubt because I think the human error rate for supernatural claims is very high. And furthermore, I think an all-powerful God who wanted belief to be based on history wouldn't have done such a poor job of it. Thank you.
This time, we're going to have the three of us sitting at the table, and I've got my timer. We'll take about 15 minutes of some back and forth between Matt McCormick and Mike Licona, and then we'll open things up to the rest of the audience, and we'll finish up by 6 o'clock. I guess I can sit in the middle, but I don't really have to.
You should.
Okay. I'm like the live wire that conducts the electricity. No, the possible format here is just to open things up to Mike or Matt. Can you guys hear me okay? And let me start off by asking each of them if they'd like to ask the other one sort of an opening question or make an opening comment. And again, I'm going to keep my eye on the clock. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. All right, Matt. One thing you talked about was, let's see, because I got a bunch of things written down here. All right, you're talking about like near-death experiences. There are numerous naturalistic explanations like drugs. But what do you do with the 300 or so cases where the person is certifiably dead, and while dead, they claim to come out of the body, and they're able to report accurate information they could not have known otherwise? How do you explain this?
Well, while it's not directly to the question about the resurrection, it's sort of real pertinent to the background information here. Well, my first question, I have lots of questions for these kinds of cases. I know that many people have asserted, like you have, that folks who are, well, let's make some distinctions. I talked about cardiopulmonary dead. I think when somebody's cardiopulmonary dead, explaining how it is that that person who was unconscious on the table then is able to come back and say something about events that transpired during that period, easy. Not difficult at all, it's quite common, right? Somebody who's unconscious on the table, just like when you're having a dream at night, they've heard the doctors, overheard the doctors talking, they've seen people around the room and the like. And I'm not prepared to accept that these people, I mean, I guess it depends on the case. I want to hear about the case.
Well, statistics show that when your heart has stopped working for at least 30 seconds, the brain's not working either. So if there's no
I
brain...
just flatly disagree with that. That's just not
Well,
right.
I mean, that's not current research, okay?
That's
So
not right.
if the brain's not working after 30 seconds, after the heart's not, how are they thinking? How are they
Well,
hearing?
okay, so there's roughly 83 billion neurons in the brain with 5 to 50,000 dendritic connections each. And the metabolic processes of the neural cells depend in part upon the presence of glucose and oxygenated blood. And if you've got somebody on CPR, if you've got them on a respirator, and if we're keeping blood flow going to the brain, it's simply not the case. We don't have any reason to think that their brains have stopped working. Now, if the neural cells have ceased to function completely, brain cell death happens in a matter of minutes. Certainly complete. I've made a joke about this in previous discussions.
Hang on a second, Matt, because we do have limited time. So let me say this. Let's just suppose that you're on the table, and let's say you've got some residual brain activity like you're suggesting. Okay, I wouldn't grant that, but I'll grant it for now. How do you explain how she's able to go home and go through the rooms and explain what her family members were wearing, what they were doing, what song they were singing, what her mom was making for dinner, when she was dead at the time?
Well, this first I've ever heard of this story. It's you telling an anecdote. I don't know whether, in fact, she did any of that. I don't know if I have, or you have good reason to think that all of that happened.
Okay, if
don't know about the details.
If it did, does that cause problems with naturalism in your view?
I don't know about naturalism. Here's what would be a really interesting case. If we had a case of someone for whom all metabolic activity in their brains had ceased, and we could establish somehow during that period that some conscious event had happened, any sort of conscious
We
event,
got those
During
Pamela
that.
Reynolds.
where all 83 billion neurons have ceased their metabolic functions, and then we bring them back. And I've coined a term, I call this McCormick dead. We don't have cases like this, because once that happens, those cells don't get revived, they don't come back, they don't recover from that kind of deprivation. In order to stop the metabolic function of the cell in those kinds of cases, you irreparably damage it.
The one that
But
I
if
gave
we
you
could
is
have
Crystal
cases
Mertzloff, okay?
If we could have a case like that, where somebody was having some sort of conscious experience and we could corroborate it,
Came down to her
while
body,
your brain was completely, utterly McCormick dead, that'd be really interesting.
But let's say she wasn't McCormick dead, okay? And she's still, while she's got no heartbeat, no brain activity, she comes
Well,
out.
I'm just
okay.
denying that.
No, nothing on the EKG or the EEG. So she comes out of her body, she says, and she goes to her house and she's able to report all these things that happen. And the physicians and the hospital, the attending physician corroborated. So if the story I gave with Crystal Mertzloff is true, what does that do for atheism?
I don't know what it does for atheism. I'm not even arguing for atheism.
Let's rotate then, because
Yeah.
we're 5 minutes into our 15, and I want to give Matt a chance to ask a question from a different part of the discussion
Okay.
to mine.
Well, I'll just repeat the question that I asked at the end. And I'd love to hear from folks in the audience too. Why didn't we get better evidence for Jesus? This surely could have been better than it is.
Yeah, I think it could have been better. The question though is it sufficient? And if a financial planner came to me and said, hey Mike, I'd like you to invest $2,000 this year in an IRA with me. And let's say, all right, I'll do it, your friend. And he does, and he puts it in penny stocks. And I lose 75%. The next year he comes back to me and he says, hey, thanks for giving me that $2,000. I want you to roll all your IRAs and 401ks and put them with me and let me manage it. I say, no way, pal. You couldn't even handle right what I did give you. Could it be that maybe God says, you know what? I've given you sufficient evidence, and what I've given, you haven't handled it properly. You haven't accounted for the evidence, the historical evidence. You can't account for the supernatural. You can't account for design. Why should I give you more?
So who messed up? Was it these people in first century Palestine? They're the ones who messed up, or we're messing up because the evidence is present to us, but we're not acknowledging it?
I don't think they messed up. I think the evidence we have is good.
No, I'm asking about your metaphor concerning an investment banker. You said
I'm
that
saying, what if
somebody.
God says to you, hey, Matt, I've already entrusted some good evidence to you, and look what you've done with it.
Okay, so the point is that the reason the evidence for Jesus isn't better, it's our fault?
I'm saying, hey, if you can't even handle what he has given, he's under no obligation to give you more.
That seems
Besides,
like
he's not
changing
even
the subject
looking.
to me.
He's not looking for someone to just say, hey, I believe. Even demons believe. He's looking for people who will be followers, who will say, I buy
Okay.
into your
All right,
program.
that actually answers a really important question as I take it. Because really the only question I'm sort of interested in this particular topic is whether or not we have compelling historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I take it that you're acknowledging that it could be much better than it was, and surely an omnipotent God could have done that, but he didn't.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as being a bizarre sort of, the internal logic of that seems to be really, really strange. And surely in that kind of circumstance, folks who maintain a view like yours can't say that the rest of us are thereby being unreasonable if we're not convinced.
Well, I would say, look at what he did. If
Well,
Christianity
why is
true,
God underperforming so
I
badly
don't
in
think
this
he
case?
is. I like the way he does perform. He takes 12 knuckleheads in a dusty, remote region of the Roman Empire, and from that, a whole third of the world today claim to be Christian. That's pretty good.
Do you think God could have made Jesus' resurrection more abundantly clear and manifest to everyone then and now than
Yeah.
it currently is?
I do.
Why
I don't know
didn't he?
I don't know. I don't have to know. But it doesn't.
And
it
would you
doesn't mean
acknowledge
that.
that it looks a lot like these other natural religions and lots of
Oh,
important
no,
sort
not
of
at
general.
all. You mentioned some things like you said. The miracles for Muhammad are as well attested. Which ones do you have in mind?
I don't think they're as well attested. I think it's very easy to go find enthusiastic adherents who will construct very elaborate, very compelling sounding rationalizations for why those miracles are true and why these miracles are true. And we can find all of these folks for whom these different miracle accounts are incompatible, yet they all maintain that we've got sufficient evidence to show more or less what you're saying about a difference of incompatible miracles and a different kind of incompatible theism.
Well, actually, we don't, because Muhammad didn't perform miracles. The only miracle that is even attributed to him by Islam is the writing of the Quran, because they said he was illiterate. So I think you're mistaken on the history of Islam there. And then when it comes to miracles, they're not as well attested in other religions as we have for Christianity. The miracles of Jesus, we have are reported, let's say Mark, that's 35 to 40 years later. When you look at other stuff, like Apollonius of Tyana, that's like 125 plus years later. It's only reported by one source. You've got Josephus reporting about Hananiah ben Doza, or another one, the circle drawer. And that is like, I think Josephus is 125 years after. The next source is the Babylonian Talmud, which is hundreds, like 600 years later after the alleged event. We don't have anything close to the evidence for miracles in other religions as we have for Jesus.
We're actually to our second marker through the 10-minute mark. Let me give each of you a chance to ask one more question of each other before we open things up to the floor. Maybe just a 2-minute question for each of you.
Yeah, there's something I'd like to address that was in the book, that his book, because he's a lot more, I should say, sarcastically against Christianity than he was here. And he said how the more education you have, the less religious belief you have. And it was interesting you appealed to the Phil papers on that, because they only surveyed, they only got results back from less than 1,000 people. And it was from 99 institutions, 96 of which was secular. So it seems like it was kind of fixed from the very beginning. But you know, there's Elaine Akund at Rice University, and she did a study with over 1,600 scientists with the American Academy of the Advancement of Science, the largest academy of its own of its kind in the world. And she found that academic scientists they would develop their worldview in their adolescent years, and even before that, and certainly before they chose their career path. And they maintained those even after they became a scientist. So the bottom line there is they showed that it wasn't getting educated and receiving graduate and doctoral work that changes the view. They didn't change the view because of their education. They had it before they even got an education. So I think it's a misnomer to say that the more education you get, the less religious beliefs you have. And even in spite of that, you got...
Well, I didn't hear the question, but there's really good evidence here
How do you explain that?
from the Pew study research, for instance.
Yeah.
They've got thousands of subjects, not just scientists, but pretty reliable, as I understand it, reliable
51%
polling
are
data
theists, right?
in the Pew religious survey studies in recent years that show an inverse correlation between education and religiousness. The way in which I think this is pertinent to what the discussion we're having today is that I think it's very easy to project sort of modern sensibilities and modern ideas onto the people we've been talking about, Paul and Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John and the like. But the same point goes across time as well as it does across society. So in First Century Palestine, what levels of education, Mike mentioned 10% literacy rate, what levels of knowledge, information about the way objects and phenomena work in the world would those folks have? And that lends itself to my general point about their receptivity and their responsiveness to supernatural ideas as explanations for phenomena that's otherwise mysterious to them. So I think we have good evidence that education and religiousness are inversely related, and that projects back into time and tells us something about the folks who are telling us these
Matt,
stories.
you've got your chance at another 2-minute comment or question.
No, I'm actually good. We can
Okay.
talk.
Well, then we've got two people, Peter and Logan, who I think are going to take the
Can I just say something in
Yeah,
response to that?
that's fine. We're going to be getting the mics out
Didn't
anyhow.
have my 2 minutes.
So, yeah, the Pew research revealed that 51% of scientists and academics today, scholars and PhDs, believe that God exists and he acts in the world. Only 41% are atheists and agnostics. Another report put out by Tobin and Weinberg, two Jewish researchers in 2007, they interviewed about 1,300 professors in around 700 secular American universities, and they found that those who, so we're talking PhDs in all these universities in the US, and they found that the number of theists versus atheists and agnostics, that theists outnumber them 3 to 1. So even if you want to say that there's an inverse there, that the more education you get, the less religious beliefs you have, we still outnumber you 3 to 1. How do you like them apples?
Well, I wasn't making a claim about numbers. I've got no doubt I'm outnumbered.
This guy, I think in the corner, has been patiently waiting since like minute 1 of our questions. I'm not sure who you are, but thanks for waiting.
I'm Rick.
Oh yeah, let's give him a mic.
Got a thing here that works. Okay. I don't remember who said it first, but about the, the different levels of death, and you use the word certifiably dead, which doesn't mean anything.
Who talking to me or?
I'm talking to the obviously the religious guy on to your right. He's on your right, isn't he? Yeah.
They're both religious guys.
Anyway, but you said certifiably dead, which doesn't actually mean anything, and it's interesting to note that even presuming metabolic death, complete metabolic death, whatever that means. There was a study that I read recently from Science Daily where they did a study and they said that genes are active in the cells. Not all of the cells die until 72 hours after. So there is, some form of pseudoneural activity that's occurring well after death, even McCormick death. So there is a small ray of hope for your case in the religious sense. However, you're not providing any real evidence as far as the corroboration, because you mentioned that the doctors corroborated things. They weren't in that person's house. They can't corroborate that story. And I know Matthew Alper wrote this great book called The God Part of the Brain, which I wish was more studied and more criticized, that goes into the fact where they can simulate the out-of-body experiences quite easily with like magnetoresonance or whatever. So I mean, there is a naturalistic explanation for this, and if the human mind does work, there is a good chance that you will know what your family is wearing on a given day if you know their styles, or they may not remember, so they're more willing to backtrack and rewrite over their own memories just to say that, oh my God, she really was there, she really saw it, just because we want to believe in something that's really amazing.
Who do you prefer a response from on this?
That's a good question. I'll take a response from either. Probably both. Let's hear both.
Let me respond to that since that's directly what I said. What you said still doesn't, you talk about hope. I think that you're showing that you're hoping there for a naturalistic explanation, because even if there was some residual genetic activity within cells, that is no evidence, you have no evidence whatsoever that it's enough to show that they can hear things, they can see things that are going on, especially when their eyes are closed. So it would be your responsibility to show that that is possible. And possible is not probable.
It's your responsibility, because you're the one that's claiming they can do that.
Well, if they have no heartbeat, if they have no brain activity, to say that they got residual genetic activity in their cells, I think you're going to have to show that that is sufficient. Second, I would say that it doesn't account for the details, some of those details that can be corroborated. How do you say she knew what they were wearing, she knew what her mom was cooking, she knew what her dad was doing, she knew the song that was being sung, she knew the toys that were being played, and she gets it all right? There's a story of Pamela Reynolds, who had a brain surgery, I think it was in Texas, and a prominent cardiologist in Atlanta went and interviewed her, interviewed all the attending physicians involved. She was actually put out, her heart was stopped, the blood was drained out of her heart and brain. They opened up her skull, they did brain surgery, they had to lower the temperature of her body, I think to some, like 60-some degrees. While she was dead, she had her eyes taped shut, she had stuff put in her ears so that she couldn't hear. Then they had this machine hooked up to her that had this like tapping going on that would have been quite deafening had it not been for this stuff. But that would be to show that she was not feeling any pain or had any consciousness, because any kind of consciousness whatsoever would have showed up in the machine that was monitoring her here. She claims that while she was brain dead, she came out of her body. She's able to repeat discussions that the attending physicians had about her anatomy. She said that she floated behind a curtain and was able to report the kind of surgical tools that they used on her, which the physicians later reported they're created for this particular kind of surgery, and they're not the kind of things that you would imagine. So all these things they were corroborated by the physicians who were there. So these things are just inexplicable to say that there's some residual genetic activity that was going on.
You may have noticed that I don't have a magic buzzer here like presidential debates, so I'll just kind of be noticing who else has their hand up. And so we've got several questions. We'll try to get to each of you. Why don't you? Sure.
Hi, so my name is Huda, and this question is directed for Dr. Mike Licona. That's right. So if God gave the kind of evidence that he did, which you admit that could have been better, but you say it doesn't need to be, about the resurrection of Jesus to look for followers, as you say, then why would he give us as humans the mental capacities to reason against it and yet expect us to deny those capacities and rely on anecdotal authority?
That's a fair question. Let me turn that around and say, we could ask the same question and say, why are there Holocaust deniers? Why are there people who deny that Jesus ever existed when it's only like 7, according to Richard Carrier, the leading proponent of that view, there's only 7 scholars in the entire universe who hold that view. And say, okay, well, God, if Jesus really existed, why didn't you give people, why didn't you give more evidence so that people using their rational skills would be convinced? And you could say that to Holocaust deniers, you could say it to Jesus mythers, and say, well, maybe your burden of proof is just too high. And I would say that regarding the resurrection. And this afternoon's discussion does the historical evidence justify belief in Jesus' resurrection? So we could say, you could say, well, I want more before I believe. Okay, if you want more, that's fine. But the question is there enough to justify belief? And when you look at historical method and how you justify historical descriptions, you follow that method, and there's certainly enough evidence, historical evidence, to justify belief.
Yeah, that's good.
That's really interesting. I think in other ordinary circumstances, all of that would make a lot of sense. But the wrench that gets thrown in the gears here is that part of the hypothesis that we're being presented with is that the all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe is responsible for this body of merely sufficient historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And the real question is whether or not the evidence makes it compelling or makes it reasonable to believe. The evidence for the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe would be, by hypothesis, much more robust and would be vastly more compelling than the evidence that looks like one of these other natural religions. I mean, I think under ordinary historical circumstances, Mike's making a bunch of really great points about our method for evaluating historical information, and he's absolutely right about this is the way we draw conclusions about Caesar crossing the Rubicon and the like. But what the particular claim we're wondering about now is not about crossing the Rubicon. We're asking about a supernatural event, and a supernatural event that's alleged to be authored by an omnipotent being. And suddenly now we've got this question, well, why isn't God bowling 300 on this one? Why is he underperforming so poorly when he'd clearly be capable of doing so much more?
Thank you for passing on your follow-up. I'm probably going to want to institute a pattern of no follow-ups from the same audience member until we have everybody get their first crack at it. Who wants one?
Thank you both for your presentations. My question is for Dr. McCormick. And it kind of relates to what you were just discussing, but Mike's response to you on the evidence, or the degree of the evidence, if you will, was, well, gee, there's 1 billion Christians in the world today. It amounted to something. And what struck me toward the end of your presentation, I think you may have fallen into your defense lawyer thing that you warned us against, because you threw up 500 gods. It was a little small print. I couldn't see them all. but I suspect that you could probably put all the adherents to those gods in a room today. So does that trouble you that there's a comparative there, that, you know, one set of evidence? One set of evidence has produced a billion people, while the other evidences, which were obviously false or demonic, have gone away.
No,
Does that trouble
you're
you?
absolutely right. Christianity is a vast global movement, and it has hundreds of millions of adherents. Viewed from one perspective, that looks like a problem for me, I think, is what you're getting at. Because how would so many people be off base here? Now, I think I find issue with your suggestion that the bulk of those people, or all those people, conducted the sort of historical investigation that Mike's engaged in, and as a result of their inquiry, then drew this conclusion on the basis of the historical evidence. I think when you go poll or talk to people who are self-professed Christian believers, the bulk of them won't say, "Oh, I believe because of compelling historical evidence in favor." Lots of people are making these arguments, and, scholars are making these arguments out there, but I don't think the bulk of them actually do that. I see it more as admittedly a vast, powerful social, political, cultural movement, and it's got a lot of traction. As has Islam, as has Buddhism, as has Hinduism, and human history is full of failed religious movements, and we've got some big winners these days. And for those of us who find ourselves living in this environment, we've got to draw a reasonable conclusion about, well, what should I make of all of these believers around me who find this so compelling? So it's a great question.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Licona. Did I say it right? Oh, you were discussing about evidence for the historical resurrection of Jesus. And one of your evidence was the Gospels. And even through your slides, you said out of the 4 Gospels, 2 of them you give a little bit more credit to than the other 2. And then, of course, Dr. McCormick comes on and he explains, and from what I've read before, is the dates that these were written are way, way after the alleged incident. And even then, they're just copies and copies of the original. So we're talking, I believe, almost 200 years after. So how do you wrap your head around that, not from a religious perspective, but from an evidence perspective, to say this is enough to show that this happened?
Yeah, good questions. So I would say, first of all, that the Gospel of John, probably the latest gospel to be written, it's about the same distance as, say, interviewing a World War II veteran right now. Okay? Now, History Channel does it all the time. If they were there, they were eyewitnesses, we look at that and say, great, no problem. And that's John. If we're looking at Mark, then we're looking at more like closer than Vietnam, actually. A couple years after the Vietnam War, from that point until today, is what you're looking at for the Gospel of Mark, and maybe even earlier than that. When it comes to the copies and copies of copies, well, we've got between 9 and 15 manuscripts that are dated within 5 to 150 years of the originals. It's pretty good. And we have 5,839 Greek manuscripts. That's what the New Testament was originally written in. 5,839 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. The closest second place is the Homeric epics. And you have just under 2,000 of those, and the earliest was written about 500 years later. If you're looking at Plutarch, much of what we know about the past was written by Plutarch. You're looking at, for the fall of the Roman Republic, you're looking at maybe 50 manuscripts, period, from Plutarch. And the earliest was written about 800, 900 years later. So what we have for the New Testament is just amazing in terms of the quality of evidence, for the manuscript evidence. And even Bart Ehrman, he's a friend of mine, he's an atheist, New Testament scholar. We've debated 5 times. I like the guy, we get along really well. And Ehrman has said that of all the discrepancies we have between the manuscripts, and there are tons of them, none of them impact any essential Christian doctrine, and that scholars today regard the New Testament, the Greek text that we have in the New Testament, as virtually 100% of what the originals actually said.
I think there's two people up here. Oh, sorry. After him.
This is also for Dr. Lacona. Earlier you talked about why give us more when we haven't believed based on what we've already gotten, and you used example from stock trading. And as someone who has taken a bit of basic economics, I admit I'm not an economics major, but God doesn't have to deal with a certain element that humans do have to deal with, which is scarcity. He doesn't have to limit himself. There's no need for him to limit himself. He's infinite. Am I incorrect in saying that?
No, I think he's infinite. Yeah.
So,
I can't prove that.
in that sense, why, if he doesn't have the need to reduce what he has to do because he doesn't have this scarcity issue that we as humans have, which is limited resources and limited, the personal case that you used, money, why not maybe just put some inexplicable thing down on the ground for us so that we knew that there is stuff that we cannot explain? It wouldn't have been hard. It would have been like
No.
swatting a fly for us.
I think that's a fair question, kind of like hers, fair question she asked. And, you know, I don't know why he didn't give us more. That doesn't mean we're not justified in believing, based on the historical evidence, that Jesus rose from the dead. It just means I can't answer why God would have acted the way he did. I've been married for over 29 years, and I can tell you, living with my wife virtually every day, there's a lot of things that she does that I don't understand why she does them. And if I can't understand my wife after 30 years, I'm not surprised if I don't understand why the creator of the universe doesn't do things the way I want him to at times.
Dr. Lacuna, but I'd like to hear Dr. McCormick's answer too. But primarily, regarding all the paranormal, out-of-body, near-death experience, all of that, are you, back up, the sun used to be a paranormal a supernatural experience. Human impregnation used to be a supernatural, unexplained, treated as a supernatural. Disease, floods, and famine, and all that was attributed to gods. Supernatural, we didn't understand it. We now know, we have evidence. We understand modern sciences explain them. Are you willing to accept that perhaps all of those apparitions and all of those experiences actually happen? The accounts are real, but perhaps there is, as yet, an unfound natural explanation. Science hasn't found it yet, but perhaps apparitions are real. Perhaps out-of-body experiences are entirely factual. How do you know they're supernatural? How do you not know they are actually natural? We just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, fair question. I would say I have to be open to the possibility that science will discover some way in the future to explain those, not only explain those in natural terms, but also show that that's the preferable explanation rather than a priori presupposing naturalism. But I would say based on our current scientific knowledge right now, it's what we do know about science that renders them as supernatural events and not natural.
Did you want to respond to this question too?
I lost my thoughts, I won't.
Got some people over here, I think. So, okay.
Just to help clarify the lady's comment or question, people believe in Plato and Socrates. Plato's documents were 12 writings, I believe, and they were written, the closest copy they have is 300 years old. Socrates, I think, is 700 years old or 1,000.
Are you asking McCormick this question, or?
That was just a statement.
I have
Okay.
a response if you have a
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I want to emphasize this point again. You're absolutely right, and Mike's made some good points about how we've got historical evidence, sometimes thin, sometimes sketchy historical evidence from what appears to be pure sources for some events that presumably will all take to be transparent and obvious, and we take it to be historically corroborated. I want to make a really sharp distinction between when ancient peoples report things like invasions or battles or who's Caesar, or what did Caesar do,
Crucifixions.
or when Lincoln got shot or what have you, when they make natural claims versus when they make supernatural claims. And I think you all are already with me on this, that we're some World War II vet to tell us a story about watching somebody miraculously revived from the dead on the battlefield. We wouldn't take that as seriously as perhaps some of the other claims. I'm skeptical about magical claims when they come from ancient people. And I think for good reason. So we got to separate those two, and it's not merely a matter of this conflation. It's not merely a matter of establishing that some ancient person believed something and they wrote it down. I might even be prepared to grant that. Somebody believed, Paul evidently believed, that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not contesting that at all. And I'm not contesting that lots and lots of people believe all kinds of weird magical things. And I think first century people believed even more of them. But we can't simply read that off for face value and go, he believed it, therefore it must have actually happened. And I hear that slip, that conflation happen a lot, where we move from so-and-so said it, it's been historically corroborated that they said it, to therefore it happened. Well, that works for crossing rivers. But none of us take that to be obviously the case for magical claims.
Yeah,
And I'll
I
just
think-
throw the Salem witch trials point out there, right? We've got a mountain of evidence about so-called eyewitness testimony about real magic and real witchcraft in Salem in the 1600s. We've actually got the documents. And you all don't probably, although I got to find out, triangulate, depending on who I'm talking to, you probably don't think that magic was real there. But the evidence is much better there for thinking that magic was happening there than happening in Jerusalem. So I'm just trying to illustrate this point that magic is a different kind of claim.
Actually, I don't agree that the evidence is better for the supernatural element in the Salem witch trials than for the resurrection. Because you don't have a lot of these, you've got some cases here where the naturalistic explanations do kick in and can better explain some of those phenomena, like they were allowing spectral evidence. So if a person just said, hey, I see a ghost, a spirit next to that person, then they admitted that as evidence. And apart from that, no one would have been killed at the Salem witch trials. I also say that by going by that, you say, we got all this good evidence at the Salem witch trial thing, and we reject the supernatural element, even though with all this evidence. Well, you know, for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, we only have, I think it's less than half a dozen sources written within 2 centuries of the event itself. So given that, we should reject Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, because the evidence is better for the Salem witch trials and the supernatural elements than we have for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon.
Caesar is purported to have performed many magical feats. One of the other things that those sources that Mike's referring to is that lots of people at the time thought that Caesar had magical powers.
One other
Don't
thing,
take those
Where do
to
you
be
get that
face
from?
value.
I think
Where do you
people-
get that from?
Well, there are lots
I
of,
read the ancient sources on this, so where do you get that from?
I can dig it up.
Tell me one of the miracles that he's alleged to have done.
I'll have to dig it up. I don't have, it's just.
can I finish real quick?
I've got two small problems. One is that we've got 2 minutes left of our scheduled event time. And then the second is you haven't really gotten to ask the question you wanted to ask because of that introductory comment about Plato. So why don't you fire it off real quick and that'll be.
Okay, well, it's just, there's 44 authors in the Bible. And there was, the comments that were made in the New Testament, they were never contradicted because he did them at the very same time that Paul saw, or the authors of the Gospels saw what happened. People who saw Christ die, people who saw or were during that time never.
Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses, so they didn't
No.
see it, but they got
Right.
their information from eyewitnesses. Do you have a question? Because we're limited on time here. You got to go real quick.
Okay, well, no, there's 60 books. They all agree. If the Bible, people get confused with the Bible because they think it's just one book, but it's 44 authors and 66 books that agree on the same thing.
Well, Listen, thank you for your comment, and I am going to actually wrap up our event in terms of its formal time. You're welcome to stay here and chat with people in the room if the people you want to chat to prefer to stay around. We only have this room until 6:30, so it's like 30 more minutes. I'd like you to go ahead and join me in thanking both of our speakers for today's event.